Welcome everyone to the Critical Game Production panel. This is Nico. I'll be moderating today for all of us, and I'm super excited on having this opportunity on sharing with these awesome scholars and with also so many like diverse people here. Just to let you know, we have other colleagues, scholars, we have artists, we have students, we have enthusiasts here. So it's great to have like these diverse people here. So to start, I would like to express our dearest gratitude to our dear guest and also to the institutions that help us make this event possible, like the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at UC Riverside, and the Center for Ideas and Society, also from the University of California, Riverside, and to our colleagues, students, and friends joining us today in this panel. For you to know, this event it's organized by Ludocritica, a critical game studies network, and by Rio Junto Art Collective, an art collective based in Southern California. More people coming, that's awesome. So I'm going to share a little bit my screen just to give some housekeeping announcements. So Ludocritica, it's a critical games studies network based in Chile, expanding to Latin America. And I wanted to share also the information of this upcoming Congress that we are going to be hosting in January, from January 9th to 11th of next year on January. The call is open for artists, academics, enthusiasts to send your proposals. This is our Instagram, Ludocritica, in case that you want to stay in touch. We have this channel also with some of the videos of our activities. And this is Rio Junto Network. This is the webpage, the Instagram of our projects. We've done different activities, having awesome activists and game artists. So you can check our additional um, additional events there, or you can find them in my site on Cultural Organization. We have these two awesome talks by Pablo Cuarta on Atuel and ecological narratives from documentary video games. We have the interview to Rashid Aboueide, the author of Layla and the Shadows of War, in this terrible context that we're living, where a genocide is being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. And soon we're going to have also the video from Valery Petrov, an Ukrainian game designer that is doing ludic activism from Ukraine in these terrible times with the Russian and the ongoing Russian invasion to their territory. So with that said, I want to start this awesome event. I'm super excited about this because these are scholars that have been inspiring my work and also like my own artist practice. As I mentioned, I'm Nico, but I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Riverside. I'm also co-founder at Rio Junto and co-founder of Ludocritica, the critical games network based in Chile, expanding to the rest of Latin America. So if you're from Latin America and you would like to join, please send us a message to our page. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our first guest. First guest is Brendan Keogh. Brendan is a Brisbane-based academic and critic. He currently works at Queensland University, where he is a senior lecturer in the School of Communication and a chief investigator in the Digital Media Research Center. He has written about the art, industry, and culture of video games for a range of international outlets, including Edge, Polygon, Kotaku, Unwinnable, The New Statesman, Ars Technica, and Overland Literary Journal. He is the author of The Video Game Industry Does Not Exist, A Play of Bodies, How We Perceive Video Games, and Killings is Harmless, a critical reading of Spec Ops: The Line. With Benjamin Nicol, he is the co-author of the Unity game engines and the circuits of cultural software, and he is also a game developer and a co-founder of the Squiggly River Game Collective. With that said, please, Brendan, the stage is yours.
Great. Thanks, Nico. Hi, everyone. Sorry to read out that really long bio. I probably mostly wrote for my bosses at university. Cool. Yeah, look, I'm super excited to be here. Really excited. As I said before everyone joined, to be other speakers, just really cool to see these kind of three different topics in conversation in a way we don't normally see. So Cool to be here. Let's go. Confirm my speaking language. I am. Oh, right. Zoom thinks we have soft languages. Cancel that. That's funny. All right. Screen sharing. Hoping my slides are visible. If anyone wants to nod, someone can tell me if I can't see it. Um, cool. Nico's the only face I can see. Nico, can you see my slides? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Sorry, I couldn't see anyone else nodding. I'm sure everyone was. So I thought what I would contribute. I'll just start my timer. Yeah, cool. So I thought what I would contribute to this discussion was kind of some of my research on game developers, game development labor, building off my recent book, The Video Game Industry Does Not Exist, as well as also kind of think about that, which came out early last year, right at the time the game industry started collapsing on a global scale. So I thought it might be interesting to then kind of reflect on that, what I kind of, the precarity and stuff I revealed in that book in the context of what's going on now, and maybe raise some questions we can then pick up on in discussion time. So I guess the two different parts of this talk, I suppose, and the third part's really just the final slide. It's just firstly just kind of, I guess, for provocation about commercial game production has never been sustainable, or the actual developers making games. Like, studios have been sustainable, careers have not. So that's kind of just always been true. If you look at IGDA surveys, the average game developer age always kind of just stops at about 30, no matter how old the game industry is. Like, people just give up on kind of making games around there because it's just unsustainable to do it. But what we're seeing now as well is that for companies as well, making games is just increasingly unsustainable economically as well. Um, so let's kind of talk into why that's happening, I suppose. So as we mentioned a couple of times, I had this book come out early last year called Video Game Industry Does Not Exist, which is a nice, calm, unprovocative title with MIT Press. It's open, what's the right word? Open access. So you can just Google it and download a PDF of it, which is great, which you can do for all academic work anyway, but you can do it legally for this one. This kind of came out of a long research fellowship that I was lucky enough to get funded by the Australian Research Council, essentially of the state of game development in Australia, largely driven by what I came to realize to articulate eventually that like making game production is cultural production primarily. It's rather than say technical production or some other kind of production. And that doesn't mean it's special necessarily, but it means it has particular characteristics and particular challenges that we don't necessarily account for if we think of the games industry as just a bunch of companies hanging out working like companies that make refrigerators or something. But instead, if we think of game producers, essentially, like I think my pitch was, if games are art and game developers are artists and artists are poor, so how do we actually account for that when all we talk about is how much money the games industry makes? So I did about 200 odd interviews of game developers, mostly in Australia, but some in Europe and America as well, and a few on Zoom to Southeast Asia because the pandemic screwed up that part of my fieldwork. Did a big survey, put it all together into this book. And I guess the kind of like boil down the whole, I guess, theoretical contribution of this book into like a single slide is what I essentially say is this is how we generally think of where video game production occurs. Like this is where game developers are positioned in relation to each other. But actually it looks like this, that beyond industrialized video game production, there's a much, much broader field of video game production, and game makers are positioned somewhere in this field, maybe in the part of a field we call the industry, maybe more broadly outside of the industry. And that kind of, and I kind of build off Pierre Bourdieu's idea of cultural fields and fields of cultural production to think about just how do different game developers position themselves in relation to other developers, and that kind of tension between, making money and being an autonomous artist, which is very much a play in game development as well. And you kind of see this tension throughout all aspects of game development, kind of cultures at a local and international level. I really just like this example of way back in 2004 when the Free Play Independent Games Festival in Melbourne, Australia, in its very first iteration was giving shit to, the bullshit corporate themes of the Australian Game Developers Conference, which in its current iteration, GCAP, is actually happening right now this week. So already there was this countercultural, we're not them positioning of free play, right? And that still happens today with, indie and AAA and all sorts of different types of game making. Where am I? And so this is just like some quotes from some of the people I spoke to. I spoke to this one developer in Melbourne just about the local game making community. Melbourne's like a really vibrant, I guess, really the heart of game development in Australia. Untitled Goose Game, Cult of the Lamb, um, so many other big Australian games kind of came out of Melbourne. And this developer kind of really articulated this idea that there was like an industry and a scene, though I think I brought the word scene into it in the question, so don't read too much into that. And just talking about how there used to be these kind of two separate communities and, kind of with the rise of, I guess, like platform capitalism and entrepreneurial approaches to game development, those two sides of game development got really, really um, confused and ambiguous in Melbourne, where like who was like working in games and who was just like some weird arty kid making stuff around their job at a supermarket got really, really confused and blurred in a really interesting way. So that position taking within the field or industry got really, really complicated in a way that I think really just happens in all creative scenes eventually. So I found this really interesting that this games are just like any other cultural field was kind of what I was getting at. But also this ambiguity, this like blurred of like who's professional and who's not, who's in the industry, who isn't in the industry. I essentially made the case that this is much, much harder to figure out what, I guess, side of that industrial line people are on than it used to be because of the rise of platforms, because of the rise of, I guess, entrepreneurial work approaches and indie and whatnot. And that behind what are often like formal, legally registered companies is like a huge amount of precarity that often is just not visible unless you go talk to people. So this studio, for example, is about 4 people that are working in a games co-working space. None of them are employees; they are all like directors of a company, as far as the tax office was concerned, and they're all underpaying themselves, or like essentially putting their own money into this company to stop it falling over, essentially, because they just felt like they had to do that to kind of perform success. And so, really, they were like, being wage thefted, I suppose, by Steam and whatnot in a real indirect way, like Uber drivers, but like it's not illegal because they're not employees, they're employers. So these kind of traditional structures or categories of who's in charge and who isn't in charge, who's exploited, who's exploiting, just gets really, really complicated when the industry kind of fragments into this kind of much, much more blurred situation that game making looks like now. And how far? I'm going pretty fast. That's right. So this is really at odds with, I guess, how we popularly kind of imagine the history of the games industry as kind of like, the history of the games industry is often told with, big companies like Atari did its thing, then made some mistakes, and then Nintendo came along and saved us from Atari's mistake and saved us from all the bad people who were making bootleg games or bad quality games with their Nintendo seal of approval and all of this. And Casey O'Donnell's Developer Dilemma has a really excellent kind of breakdown of Nintendo's business models in the late 80s, which I can't recommend enough. But this kind of like, I guess, history of like the industry first and then other stuff happening around the industry is really at odds with like every actually, I guess, rigorous researched history of the games industry in specific local and national contexts that many, many people have written. And the same story you see time and time again, kind of regardless of the geographic context these various authors are writing about, is that a bunch of people were making stuff in a kind of non-commercial way, and then that game making activity was selectively industrialized in different ways in different local contexts. So whether that's demo scene people in Finland starting mobile games companies eventually, or bootleggers in South Korea who are just taking Japanese IP and just putting a kind of counter-imperialist spin on it, as Ben Nickel talks about, which then evolves into what is now the billion-dollar Korean or billions of dollar Korean games industry. Essentially, like the field comes first and the industry comes afterwards is kind of the point I try to make of the book, as opposed to there is an industry and on the edges of that industry there's like weird indie stuff going on. So I'm really trying to flip the positioning of industrial game production within a broader field of games production. And I guess the big point I really get to in that is just that that video game production occurs like before it is industrialized. It happens beyond the purview of industrialized companies, still, even after it industrializes. And it persists beneath industrialized game production as its very foundation. And that final one, I unpack in the final chapter of the book, kind of drawing off Bo Bruberg's idea of like who's responsible for making video games better, and essentially who creates the cultural value and cultural capital that then large companies are able to kind of use to say games actually matter now while they make, Assassin's Creed 58 or whatever. Like all the kind of twine queer game makers working in poverty who then, you know, a AAA developer can then show up at GDC and talk about how diverse game development is because these queer people are working in twine, even if they're not making money. And so you kind of have this like weird extraction of cultural capital ongoing. There's a video I won't play now, but it's really interesting in Australia that the government made to try to Australia got this new tax offset for to try to attract AAA studios to Australia. And most of the games that were showing in that video, like look at all the cool games being made in Australia, were absolutely games that would not make enough money or have cost enough to be eligible for that tax offset. It was more advertising the skills and the labor here that could be exploited. And that's very much that same beneath thing that I'm thinking of there. But essentially, there's a whole bunch of video game production beyond its industrialization. I guess is kind of, I'm just trying to denormalize or decenter the industry as the home of legitimate game making. And I guess this slides were just an aside, but really kind of inspired by and really love this quote from Stephanie Bullock and Patrick Lemieux just about, how the video game industry privatizes the cultures of game and play. Like that, we've kind of got this commons enclosure of like play and games by the games industry. But Anthropy kind of makes the same point that the games industry doesn't own game production or games play, but it can happen elsewhere. So that's kind of what, in very, very broad strokes, that's the book. Like, I would like to think the book itself is a bit more sophisticated and nuanced than that, but it's all in there. But then that book came out early last year, and then since then we've seen the game industry kind of absolutely collapse, which I guess was particularly interesting to me, considering my book was largely just about how precarious the games industry is, and despite these slogans about how much money games make, most game developers are precarious and poor and have no sense of a career trajectory beyond the next 5 years. And some game developer friends acknowledge this irony of my book's title. So you probably know all these depressing stats, so I'll run through them pretty quickly, but we're over 23,000 industry layoffs since the start of last year. They're just the ones we know about. It's probably a lot higher than that. A lot of indie teams just kind of disappearing quietly without much fanfare because investment is drying up. Like, it's just not the easy place for venture capital to put its money that it once was, or at least I don't think it is. A lot of studios are closing down even after releasing successful games. Unity and Unreal are laying people off. Really interesting stat from, I think it was a PlayStation shareholder report about how half of all PSN users are still logging in from a PlayStation 4. In other words, they haven't been convinced they should buy a PlayStation 5. And why would you? It's a huge, ugly, non-rectangular console. And I hate that there's one in my lounge room. It's hideous. Doesn't need to exist. And then you also have these DIE stats from Newzoo, over 60% of playtime, I think this is just on PC, in 2023 was on games that were released over 6 years previously. So these are your like Fortnites and Minecrafts and PUBGs, your like live service games, right? Of the remaining 40% of playtime, a lot of that playtime was from your annual big releases like Call of Duty and FIFA. So all up in 2023, there's like 8% of total PC playtime for like new IP and indies and everything. So not a whole lot of playtime left over. And then we just have the simple fact that like it is not economically feasible. The business model of making big AAA games just doesn't make sense anymore. Like the whole selling point of AAA is that this game, the way you develop demand for AAA is like this game looks so much better than the previous game. It's so much bigger than the previous game. So rather than like any sort of aesthetic innovation, you innovate on scale and technology. Like as this great Polygon essay said around Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, scale becomes an end to itself. Games are sold on how big they are, how many square miles the map is, whatever. And we've just reached a point where that's diminishing returns, right? It takes like so long to make a AAA game. It costs so much money. It just doesn't make sense to do this anymore. The stakes are so high. And everyone just wants to try to become the next platform live service game anyway. Like, so it's kind of a 1% winner takes all kind of situation. And we kind of got here through decades of just like, I guess, this techno-deterministic way of thinking about better technology equal better game. The Nintendo 64, 3 times faster than the PlayStation. What does that mean? No one knows, but it clearly means Nintendo is better. And yeah, this doesn't make sense anymore in a world where like the PS5 Pro is being sold for PlayStation 4 game, and it looks exactly the same as it did the day it came out on PlayStation 4. Like, you will not have a better experience playing Last of Us 2. You will not get more aesthetically or narratively out of it because of these extra pixels or 2 frames per second faster. Like some people are convinced by this, but far fewer people than ever before. So this doesn't produce new demand for people to keep buying new technology the way it once did. So the AAA model is fundamentally just doesn't make sense anymore. It's unsustainable. And of course, like as like Ben Abraham and Alenda Chang and others have said, like it's unsustainable ecologically as well, right? To just keep making these new consoles with these resources that use more and more energy than the previous generation. And there I'll just shout out, I think he's in chat, one of my new PhD students, David, Kenkate, who is looking at what video game aesthetics are going to look like post kind of us dealing with it. So David published some stuff and people can go read it. Anyway, and then the other thing we have, like, so if we link this back to the book where like the industry is kind of like making that claim to being where legitimate game making happens, we also have had this situation historically where like AAA or like large scale game development is seen as like what you should be aiming for. And, you know, I spoke to indies whose career goals were like, hopefully this game is successful, then we can make a bigger one that, you know, trying to get as close to AAA as they possibly can. And almost not even knowing they're doing that, right? Just, but we have to get bigger. We have to like, I want to make the games like the games I enjoy playing, not these like hindered, technologically restrained indie games that I have to make at the moment because that's all the resources I have. And so like Mighty Kingdom, a studio in Adelaide, does a lot of marketing games and phone games for kids for like different franchises like Lego. I spoke to their general manager in 2018, and he was really negative of these teams that stayed small. Like, I won't name the kind of studios he was talking about, but the studios that have a big hit and then don't hire people, right? And he kind of saw that as really greedy. Things like you have to grow, you have to spend your own money, get as big as you can. And I think, yeah, this year, Mighty Kingdom is just absolutely falling apart. They went public, they got into the stock market, abysmal failure, 30% of their workforce is gone. Like, they're probably not going to survive much longer, I imagine. Like, it's just like, this doesn't work, right? And Halfbrick in Brisbane did this as well. Like, we got successful, we'll grow bigger. Oh, wait, for scaling from small indie to large AAA, it doesn't actually make sense. Like, you don't, it doesn't, it's not how it works. And I like kind of contrasting this with House, who made Untitled Goose Game in 2019, four friends from Melbourne. And they said very explicitly in an interview with ABC Arts after Untitled Goose Game came out that, you know, just because we had a massive commercial success doesn't mean we're going to hire 50 more people and make a bigger, more ambitious game. We just want to keep doing what we're doing. And I think this is clearly a much more sustainable and feasible way to make games, but it requires that mind shift of like, the next game doesn't have to be bigger or more technologically impressive than the previous game. We need to find other ways that innovation kind of happens in games. And this is a game they're currently working on called Big War. It's really cool. You should play it when it comes out. I'm nearly done. I didn't have a good segue to this one, but like obviously, when I was doing my interviews in 2018, unionization came up a whole lot. It was like 2018 was when Game Workers Unite started becoming a real big deal. But then also just a lot of confusion. Well, if AAA isn't sustainable, and also I think AAA is like a blip both historically and geographically beyond North America and Western Europe and Eastern Asia, like AAA doesn't really exist. Like indie is kind of what most of the game development looks like in the world of studios, about 5 people, dependent on big platforms. What does unionization look like in that context? How do you organize workers globally that have been very deliberately disorganized by platform capital? As one of my interviewees said, it was like, how do you unionize against Steam? How do you unionize against Sony? That's something we haven't fully figured out yet, I don't think. There's a lot of really interesting experiments, especially around gig workers on Uber and delivery drivers. Jamie Woodcock's done some really interesting research around this stuff. But it's something the game industry has to figure out. That all the momentum around GWU started with indie developers for whom unions have not historically worked for, which is a fascinating contradiction to me. I want to unpack more. Oh yeah, and I think there's some really interesting work around like platform socialism and platform communism, which is worth exploring there. But I have nothing to say about that. I just wanted to nod to that book. So finally, then, what am I? 19 minutes, nearly done. You've all probably seen this meme that goes around Twitter a bit, which I think is just it's actually just a really important, I guess, manifesto or like cry for just a differently structured games industry or a differently structured mindset about how game production might work, which requires players and makers and scholars and everyone to think totally different about how games as cultural production even work. But essentially, like the primary historic model for growing demand, which is this technology is better than the previous technology, just did not make any economic sense anymore, even if you're not trying to disrupt the system. But that doesn't work. And of course, that's why we end up with like cost cutting instead and trying to use AI, which just makes everything even worse. What else do I actually want to say from this slide? Essentially, I always try to say to like policymakers, I think game studios should operate more like bands. Like music is a better parallel than the film industry for the games industry. Like you don't hire 10 new drummers just because your first album was a success. And I think that's essentially the mindset most small independent game studios should also be thinking about. And also game developers need ownership over not just access to the means of production distribution. There's a whole lot of, Unity loves talking about how they democratize game development, definitely true to an extent. But like, as we saw when Unity tried to change their pricing model, that's very contingent on Unity doing whatever the hell Unity wants. So like more open source things like Godot, and I know itch.io is not open source, but it's more open. There's kind of exciting potential in some of these for maybe more open kind of game production as well. But yeah, and then I guess the question is that are sustainable game development, commercial game development actually incompatible under capitalism? And the answer is pretty much just yes, essentially. And very quickly, final slide is just I'm reading this book at the moment, which has a very similar title to my book, which I think a lot of people here might find really interesting, where Justin O'Connor makes this really interesting point that just the reduction of culture to a commodity for consumers and the whole idea of creative industries, he just kind of systemically maps how terrible this has been and makes this point that seems like it could have been written about the game industry. But the search for profit and control has come with a failure to ensure the sustainability of the very sources of creativity on which they depend. And I think that's absolutely true for the games industry as we're seeing at the moment. But yeah, I'll leave that there. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for such a wonderful presentation. Great. Thank you for also for sticking to the time. So now we can continue with the second presentation. We are having the great Alenda Chang. Alenda is an associate professor in film and media studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, with a multidisciplinary background in biology, literature, and film. She specialized in emerging eco-critical theory with the analysis of contemporary media. The writing has been featured in numerous journals, including Feminist Media Histories, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, the Journal of Gaming and Virtual Worlds, and Resilience, and her 2019 book, Playing Nature, Ecology in Video Games, from the University of Minnesota Press, developed innovative ecological frameworks for understanding and designing digital games. Along with film and media studies, professor Leila Shireen Sagar, Professor Alenda Chang is also the co-founder of the digital media studio Wireframe. Wireframe was established to support collaborative and cutting-edge research and teaching in new media with an emphasis on global human rights, social justice, and environmental concerns. Located adjacent to the Digital Arts and Humanities Commons, the studio provides a space for production and critical engagement across media, including games, data visualization, installation art, virtual augmented reality, projection mapping, performance and installation, live streaming, 3D modeling, mobile apps, and even social media. And lastly, Professor Alenda Chang has most recently co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Eco-Media Studies, which is fully available, open access, and contributed with writing to eco games, playful perspectives on the climate crisis, and the forthcoming interspecies future, a primer. So with that said, we are now opening the space in the garden for Professor Alenda Chang.
Thank you. Wow, that was super long and it's super embarrassing. Thanks, Nico. Anyway, I shared in chat this an older piece, the Divest from the Video Games Industry, that Marina Kataka of Analgesic wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think it's very relevant to what we just heard. This is very inspiring. Thank you for having me. Oh, I have to confirm my speaking language. It is not Spanish, so hang on a second. Okay. I'm probably speaking too fast for the closed captioning, sorry. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen. And that look normal? Okay. Okay, someone yell if not. So, I thought because it's a critical game production panel, I would do something sort of uncharacteristic for me, which was, talk about some sort of pseudo-ethnographic work that I did when I was participating in the climate special interest group of the IGDA a few years ago. And this, if you're interested in a more fleshed out version, is in the Eco Games volume, which Nico referred to. And I think the idea of this would be to wrestle with the question of what is sustainability in the game industry. And as Brendan was saying, is this a question of economic viability and longevity, which is even just, I'd say 5 years ago, most of the articles that would come up if you were looking at sustainability of the game industry would be about financial sustainability. And only recently has that kind of sustainability become more of an ecological thing. And we're starting to get this tension between those two versions. But I do think this kind of Investopedia definition of sustainability about being able to support a process continuously over time has both of those dimensions, right? The economic and the environmental. And then I also think it's worth quoting from Escobar in his designs for the Pluriverse. And I think I will be quoting him a lot. I'm sorry about this, but I love this idea that a lot of what goes on under the guise of design right now involves intensive resource use and vast material destruction. And so he says, design is central to the structures of unsustainability that hold in place the contemporary so-called modern world. So, I think despite I think, Brendan's work, I think a lot of academic game studies still sort of operates outside of the game industry and considerations of the game industry. And I know that's not a monolith. And there is obviously a growing body of literature, like we talked about O'Donnell and Urban Balut and Brendan's work and others. But I do think in general that a lot of game studies is still sort of focused on classic textual analysis and representational analysis, which still has value. But more and more, this practice of talking about games apart from the context of production, whether it's labor or environmental standards, seems less and less tenable, right? As we move into a more climate disrupted future. And even though my own work is really primarily about kind of ecological analysis and science and technology studies approaches to games and thinking about how games transmit these implicit and explicit models of ecological relations, I have seen more and more just in the past few years, the value of opening up a dialogue with people who are actively creating games. And I think without that dialogue, that these other conversations may produce at best an analytical shift without actually creating some very important systemic change in the industry or culture at large. So in the Escobar quote, right, there's this idea that design is essential to modern life. But right now, the bulk of what qualifies as design doesn't take into account these negative impacts on the biosphere and also, more than human beings. And then Escobar later, he references Tony Fry, and he actually calls unsustainable design practices as practices of defuturing. So that's Fry's term. And a kind of rough definition of defuturing would be the reckless foreclosure of potential planetary outcomes. And, that's actually a very game-like kind of idea. So I guess, what I'm trying to get at is within game studies and game design, how can we help each other make sure that game design is not the defuturing kind of design? And I think that this necessitates a lot of us working outside of our usual comfort zones, whether it's researchers engaging with industry or vice versa, or activists and policymakers engaging with media makers. And so what I wanted to discuss today is this work or this kind of observation and engagement that I had with the IGDA Climate SIG. So in October 2020, I think, gosh, it's been a while now. A woman named Paula Esquadra reached out to me as the co-chair of a new SIG, or special interest group, within the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA. And, I was very surprised that she and some of her colleagues then at Google Stadia, which is obviously no longer existing, were actually familiar with my book from 2019, and they wanted me to come to some of these first meetings. And so, I went to some of these meetings not really knowing what to expect. And oftentimes during those early days, I was really the only academic there, although, Ben Abraham was also there, and a PhD student, Clayton Whittle, has been very instrumental in developing one of the reports that I'll talk about later. But most of the SIG's members, as you would expect, were workers either in or around the game industry. And some of them were in nonprofits, some were at large multinational game companies, some were indie. And so according to the IGDA itself, the organization has over 5,000 paid members. It has 150 local chapters and global special interest groups. And to give you an idea of how the SIGs function within the IGDA, they are completely voluntary, and they're divided into these three categories that you see here. And the New Climate SIG falls into the advocacy group, along with stuff like the Game Accessibility SIG, or ones devoted to LGBTQ allyship or mental health and so on. But if you look, by far the most SIGs are in the discipline category, which revolves around questions of game form and content, right? So the discipline SIGs include things about analog games, serious games, audio, localization, etc. And then the affinity category is really about inviting members to affiliate based on shared identity characteristics. So you get SIGs like Black in games, Chinese in games, or devs with kids. But I think one thing to note is that as the climate SIG has expanded very rapidly and clarified its goals, which I'm going to talk about, it's become very clear to me that, this is just sort of totally arbitrary, right? Because advocacy inevitably overlaps, right, with affinity and with design, these two other concerns of these other SIGs. So people advocate from a place of shared values, and they're looking to include aspects of those values in their work as game designers. So I don't have time to go through all these work streams, but Paula and Hugo Billy, who was the other co-chair at the time that the SIG started, tried to divide and conquer by creating these separate work streams. And the one that I'm going to focus on is the very last one, which was initially called design patterns. And the idea here was to give game developers practical tools and examples to help them infuse sustainability into their own game design as well as into their business decisions. And of these 4 original work streams, at least in the first 3 or 4 years of the SIG, design patterns was probably the most active. And maybe that's because it seemed to offer very tangible and manageable ways to contribute. And it was also closest to the core concerns of the membership, right, which is how to design and create games. So I'm going to focus on that one. But I want to also linger over this idea of design patterns, or even broader sustainable design patterns. And think about what exactly is being designed in those patterns, and if so, by whom. Although Escobar would have it that everybody designs, we know that design in its professional manifestations is always policed by tastemakers, right, and gatekeepers of all kinds. And so, even if we kind of narrow this to the idea of game design and patterns that are some way involved in game development, I think that still leaves a lot of leeway. So in addition to, let's say, promoting environmental realism and graphical representation, or in game mechanics, which I've written about, could design patterns include also things like procurement strategies for the energy used to power your computer on which a game is developed? Or would it include a decision to distribute a game by a digital download rather than in a shrink-wrapped box? Or would it include encouraging players to play games in low-resolution, power-saving modes when they're on the move or in a distracted state of mind? And maybe that would be better called development patterns or even distribution patterns or consumption patterns. But I think it's worth asking these questions. And as a member of the SIG, I think it's been illuminating for me to see how the language of design patterns has shifted over time. And I originally gravitated to volunteering my time in this stream because the idea of design patterns really was, it was so close to how academics talk about games, right? In terms of discrete, observable gameplay elements. And granted, we're beyond a lot of this now, but if you look back in the history, right, game studies scholars have invented endless, terms for basically design patterns, whether it's game mechanics, unit operations, algorithms, procedural rhetoric. Noah Wardrop-Fruin has a more recent take. He calls it operational logics and playable models. But of course, this is just within game studies, but I'm sure some of you are thinking this is also reminiscent of architectural discourse, right? Famously, Christopher Alexander and his language, pattern language methodology. But I would also point out that patterns also evoke sewing patterns and more craft-oriented design work. And this is itself an important material and feminist trend within critical design studies. And this is another Escobar quote, right? That is, again, very useful to think about design as referring to more than the creation of objects or buildings or even ecologically minded production. And I love this, right? The notion of design signals in his work, right? Despite all these other meanings, what it signals is diverse forms of life and often contrasting notions of sociability and the world. And if we take this broader concept of design seriously, I think, design patterns can and should refer not just to things like a game file or a device, but also to the relationships that they engender and also a holistic sense of the worlds that they bring into being. And so, I'm reading Escobar and thinking about this while also participating in the SIG and thinking, design patterns don't just need to be these kind of building blocks that we're going to slot into an existing game design to give it just the right amount of green consciousness, right? How can we think about this in a more open-ended or flexible way? And it was interesting to me, this is just like a snapshot of the Discord back in 2021 when there was kind of change afoot when the kind of people who are running this particular work stream, Hugo Billy and Arnaud Fayot from Ubisoft, there was a sort of dissatisfaction with the phrase design patterns, and they gradually shifted the terminology toward more action-laden terms. So eventually, this work stream actually split into 3 parts, and there was going to be a tactics report, an actions wiki, and then a list of games. And all of that was going to be eventually integrated. And, out of this comes, after many kind of months of authorship that was crowdsourced and editing and design, we did release this alpha version of the Environmental Game Design Playbook in, I think, April 2022. It's over 80 pages long. And, is primarily authored by Clayton Whittle. And so the nickname in the SIG was actually the Clayton Report, right? And Clayton's background was really in education. So it draws a lot on sort of the serious games and educational games literature. But, if you go into this, it's available online to download. It goes into the psychological barriers to environmental action, and then goes through in a very kind of exhaustive way these design patterns, or now tactics, right, that games and game designers can try to use to bypass or break down those barriers. I think that's the idea. And this was, again, remember, it was meant to be read and used by game developers that were short on time, but still interested in some kind of positive climate action. And so if you look at this, you'll see that, there are a lot of different categories. This is actually not the full table of contents. Part 3 goes into more social and community gameplay, but each tactic follows a similar pattern where there is an introduction, a hypothetical development scenario, reasons why you might want to use that tactic, usually an example existing game that uses that tactic, and so on. And I encourage you to look at those. So I'm going over that quickly because I actually wanted to turn to the flip side, which is a lot of my analytical interest in the SIG was just trying to figure out where agency lay, right, in this game and environment nexus, and who or what had the power to affect change. And then given that the SIG's umbrella organization, IGDA, right, is for game developers, the obvious answer would be developers. But to go back to this idea that we all have to kind of work together, I kind of want to bring in games researchers, players, policymakers, and kind of create a broader sense of, it's not just game developers who design. You could argue about modders, but even more broadly, if you see design as being deliberate creative decisions that produce particular worlds and ways of being. So I think it's better to think about who or what has the power to affect change at what level or in what ways. And so sustainable design patterns, I still like that term, might include the realm of the aesthetic, but they could also expand to think about more base level interventions into game design practice. Like I've hinted at this, right? The more mindful use of onboard computer resources or network resources. And to think about this as design and not just as optimization, right? And I think it's interesting to me that these kinds of movements are afoot, not just within game studies, but in media studies more broadly. You can think about, the interest in 8-bit retro games or text or tiny game jams. One of my favorite examples is the Small File Media Festival, which started in 2020 at Simon Fraser in Vancouver, and initially was really just pitched at filmmakers, at young filmmakers, and asking them to submit videos that were under 5 megabytes, right? And to prove, in their words, that movies don't have to be big HD files to be beautiful and inspiring. But it was only a few years later that the Small File Media Festival actually added an interactive media category. But, I think they're sort of wary of this. I think it's interesting to see that they're trying to negotiate this tension. And I think, this particular festival is a sort of practice-based extension of what Laura Marks and other scholars are really thinking about, which is the carbon footprint of things like streaming and gaming. I also think of Kara Stone's solar server project, which is basically just, a computer hooked up to a solar panel on her balcony in Alberta, which is the idea is that this is going to power low carbon video game production. And the first title is going to be a Cli-Fi game, right? And I love the site. I don't know if it's changed because I haven't been there recently, but it has this like totally old school like weather widget that tells you like what's the weather like right now on Kara's balcony, and how effective is that energy production going to be. So just to wrap up, I think I'm trying to open up a conversation around how do we make games more sustainable, not just as individual objects, but as a set of supporting practices, and as an industry or thinking not just about design, right? And I think that the example of the climate SIG, which I admittedly have not been very active in the past few years, I think gives us a good rationale for why it's important to support intersecting roles, right? Like developers that are also players and activists and concerned citizens, and to break the loop that's sort of closed of academic exchange and to recognize that designers and players also theorize through and around their practice. And so to go back to, Escobar and Fry, right? This is actually a bunch of different kind of ideas, but Escobar is really thinking about moving design away from defuturing, and maybe we could say moving it toward world building, right? And a sort of humbler attitude toward design that defers to not just the agency of non-designers, but also to the agency of a world and material forces that may or may not be visible, but undergird our gameplay. And I think that would be a truly tactical response. And I think I will end there.
Thank you, Alenda, for such an insightful presentation. Thank you. It was awesome. I can wait for the to open up the conversation, but first we have our third great speaker. So Phil, are you there? Awesome. So let me introduce you to Phil Penix-Tadsen. Phil is a specialist in contemporary Latin American cultural studies and regional game studies, with research focus on the intersections between politics, economics, digital media, and visual culture throughout Latin America and the Global South today. He earned a PhD from Columbia University and is an associate professor of Spanish and Latin American studies at the University of Delaware, where he regularly teaches courses on Latin American cultural studies and game studies. He's also the co-founder of the UD's academic program in game studies and esports. Phil Penix-Tadsen is the author of the Cultural Code, Video Games and Latin America from the MIT Press, and the editor of the anthology Video Games and the Global South from ETC Press. Both books are examples of cultural ludology, an approach he has helped pioneer as a way of analyzing video games as a unique medium, attending to the myriad ways culture is incorporated into game design and mechanics, while at the same time considering the impact of the cultural environment in which games are created, developed, manufactured, purchased, played, and otherwise put to use. So, Phil, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Nico. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for organizing and hosting this event along with UC Riverside. I really appreciate it, and also thanks to Alenda and Brendan for two really fantastic and thought-provoking talks to start this panel out. Let me share my screen so I make sure I have everything visible to everyone. So give me 1 second. Okay, hopefully we can see that. So I want to start out by saying that, well, first, can I make sure you can see okay? Yeah, everything's good. Okay, I imagine you. Okay, thank you. I want to start out by kind of stating my own positionality that I myself am a white non-Latinx scholar from the United States, professor of Spanish and Latin American studies, as well as game studies. Y soy hispanohablante. Un saludo para... Veo que hay muchos hispanohablantes presentes, así que muchas gracias por su presencia. But I wanted to say that I'm a person who is not Latinx myself, but that I have dedicated my research and teaching to Latin American game studies and media studies. And in this talk in particular, I want to talk about the role of diversity in the game development process by looking at the history of Latin America, of Latinx developers in the US and Canadian game industry in particular. I'm sorry, I lost my screen share for a second there. Oh, got to go back to that. My apologies. Sorry, I'm not seeing. Okay. Back to the slideshow. There we go. I wanted to also say that this paper that I'm presenting is part of an anthology that'll be coming out and that they're seeking contributions to, called Coded Latinx, Latinx Gaming and Game Studies in North America. The editors, who are Latinx game scholars themselves, Regina Marie Mills and Carlos Gabriel Kelly Gonzalez, are currently seeking contributions with a deadline of December 30th for your abstracts. So this is particularly about Latinx game development, game studies in the United States and Canadian context, much like my talk tonight. Not to say that it's not important to study Latin America, but this is a talk, and this anthology is about Latinx contributions to game development and game studies in Anglo North America. So the opening epigraph for my talk I give to Ed Boon, who's in the picture on the right here, co-creator of Mortal Kombat, who said, "The fact that Mortal Kombat was created by two Latinos is something that isn't really talked about much, but I think it should be." And if you're like me, you might have been surprised to learn that Mortal Kombat is actually designed by two Latinos And it, to me, was a sign that there's a lot of Latino or Latinx game history that we have not always been able to see as such. And that was part of what inspired me to do some of the research into what has become this paper and this contribution to this upcoming anthology. I'll say also, just for clarification, I'm using Latinx in the way that that it's used in the United States, which is to say a gender neutral term to refer to people from Latin America who've moved to the United States or Canada themselves, or people who have ancestors who have moved from Latin America to the United States themselves. So that's the way I'm using Latinx here. So the structure of the talk, George Gomez, a snapshot first. I'm going to talk about one of the paradigmatic early Latin American game developers, Latinx game developers, excuse me. And then talk about why the history of Latinx game developers is important. Sorry, messing with my timer because I got a little off here. Notable figures in the history of Latinx game development, and then I'll draw to a conclusion. So here we have a literal snapshot of George Gomez on his drawing design studio table at Midway Games in Chicago in an early career position. So I'm going to tell a little about George Gomez. After George Gomez graduated from the University of Illinois in Chicago with a degree in industrial design in 1978, he found his very first job designing hardware for Midway Games. He sought out this position for at least two reasons, one of which was he had a professor who told him that he should go and do something that he was really interested in because that was where he'd do his best work. And the second reason was his distinct lack of enthusiasm for the early arcade games on the market. And as he says in the final paragraph here, it occurred to me one day, with all the arrogance of a 22-year-old, that the stuff really sucked. It was pretty bad. The tanks didn't look like tanks, and the jets didn't look like jets, and the controls were abysmal. And here I'd spent all this time in school studying human machine interface and how do you make controls that feel right and look good. And so I thought, hey, why don't I call one of these companies and try to get a job doing this? It could be a lot of fun. So quite literally taking matters into his own hands, Gomez would go on to become a major force in video game and pinball development alike. He was the sole designer of the arcade classic Spy Hunter and is among the best-known pinball designers in the world, having worked with Bally Midway and Williams, and having served since 2011 as Chief Creative Officer for the industry-leading Stern Pinball in Chicago. But years before all that, when Jorge Alfredo Gomez y Mart was a child in the 1960s, he and his family fled Cuba and moved to the United States. After relocating to Chicago, young George took an interest in architecture and later product design. And given his undergraduate focus on industrial design, he set to work at Midway in making remarkably ergonomic, responsive, and custom-tailored hardware input devices, perhaps the most notable of which is the controller for the 1981 arcade game Gorf. This controller here, it's kind of like an aircraft control stick, right? It's also modified for use in other games that Gomez worked on, including Satan's Hollow here, which fell victim to the Satanic Panic and never gained the popularity of the other games on the screen, and Tron, which used a variation of the same controller. And you can see that Gomez also designed a specialized controller for the Spy Hunter arcade cabinet. Historically, it's notable that in the early 1980s, when Gomez was working at Midway, the management was really restrictive with regard to giving credit to the developers of game hardware and software because attribution was still an unresolved industry, hadn't really been worked out. So to leave his mark, George Gomez had to find a workaround. So one of the Gorf controller's most notable features was an illuminated hexagonal faceplate that pointed in the player's direction as they played. And this was an early example of a hardware device as a feedback system to the player, because the colorful squares and the black and red graph on the controller would flash. To show you each time the player successfully hit an enemy aircraft. So as you can see on the screen, this is footage of me playing that very Gorf cabinet at the Silver Ball Museum in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Highly recommend this wonderful arcade and pinball museum. But so you can see that each time your projectile connects with one of your targets, you get a little feedback in the form of a visual flash of that faceplate. So again, this is an interesting early feedback system for the player. Oops, got ahead of myself there a little bit. So what went unnoticed by Midway's upper management at the time was that Gomez had actually worked in one more innovation in the controller's design, which is that among the seemingly random red squares on the illuminated faceplate, he had left his signature by hiding the letters of his last name, Gomez, as you can see in this illustration. So they didn't flash green, but this is to show you the hidden signature of George Gomez on this early video game from 1981. So as George Gomez showed with Gorf, I argue video games have always been Latinx, even if we always haven't been able or willing to see them in that way. Moreover, representation is important, and considering that there's a high proportion of Latinx population in the United States playing video games, it's essential to highlight the work of those Latinx individuals who've been creating video games since the onset of the medium. It's not just Gorf and Spy Hunter, but also Mortal Kombat, Doom, and Journey that are the products of Latinx game developers, along with countless other games made in the US and Canada spanning the history of the medium. So I want to turn now to why the history of Latinx game developers is important. To start with, 1 in 5 residents in the United States identifies as Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, or Latine. Since the 2000 census, the Hispanic population has been the second largest race or ethnicity in the United States. Today, there are more than 60 million Latinx people in the United States, among them more than 40 million Spanish speakers. The US has the second largest Spanish-speaking population in the world after Mexico, putting it on par with the Spanish-speaking population of Argentina, Colombia, or Spain itself. The US and Canada are the center for much AAA video game production in major centers like Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, or Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, but also in many smaller studios and clusters located across the map. Canada ranks third globally in game industry employment after the US and Japan, with some 800 firms involved in game design and development, a market in which the mobile labor of a youthful and migrant workforce has included many individuals of Latinx and Latin American origin. So, given these facts, the history of Latinx impact on all forms of North American cultural production, video games included, is certainly worthy of historical and critical attention. To move to a little bit about the game development scene for Latinx developers. Fewer than 1 in 10 game industry workers identifies as Hispanic, according to the 2021 International Game Developers Association Satisfaction Survey. And that 9% includes not only every Latinx respondent in the US and Canada, but also every respondent who identifies as Hispanic in Spain, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, every other Spanish-speaking country in the world. So the IGDA report itself actually notes that its data reflect a Western bias in terms of ethnicity, language, and country of work, and that people identifying as white were highly overrepresented, and there was an underrepresentation of those identifying as Black, Hispanic, or Latino, Latina, Latinx origin. So this is one reason it's important not just to increase the proportion of Latinx individuals working at all levels of the game industry, but also to recognize those who have been making contributions throughout the entire history of video game development. Also thinking a little bit about Latinx players. Latinx players have a lot of superlatives that have been assigned to them by the data scientists. A higher percentage of Latinx players play video games and identify as gamers than any other demographic. Latinx players have a higher level of daily media exposure, time spent playing video games, video game exposure over time, and total media exposure, as well as rate of increase in video game exposure than any other demographic. So this leads to a situation where we have an ever-growing Latino population in the US and Canada, but we don't see growth at the same level in terms of representation. So this is from a 2014 study of the film and television industries in the United States by Francis Negron Muntaner, which highlights the Latino media gap, which is the gap between the growing population and the stagnant levels of representation in media industries in the United States. This is something that also has been commented on by individuals like Joshua Rivera on Kotaku, who says that diverse games are nice, but diverse studios are better, and ultimately asks, why care about a video game industry that doesn't care about me or support other people like me? And so I think that this call for greater diversity in the industry as a base level starting point for diversifying games should be a key measure and corporate goal for game developers and publishers concerned with diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially when it comes to their Latinx representation in games and in the industry itself. Some of our other panelists have referenced the work of Ergen Bulut in A Precarious Game, The Illusion of Dream Jobs in the Video Game Industry, where she points out that the video game industry not only relies on discourses of loving work and creative meritocracy in ways that mask gendered and racialized inequality, but also that industry efforts to diversify tend to approach the question as a diversity problem rather than confronting systemic inequalities as the elephant in the room for the industry's demographics, which she names as institutional cultures of white masculinity. And in spite of all of these obstacles, there's a long history of Latinx game development, and it has had a major impact on game culture. Thanks in part to the affordances that have enabled and uplifted Latinx creators in their efforts to make games. Research, such as that published here, confirms that culturally intelligent workers, those who have significant personal experience with cross-cultural interaction, have an advantage over less culturally aware colleagues because familiarity with cross-cultural experiences allows them to analyze the culture in a company and adapt to it. So there are distinct advantages to intercultural and diverse workers in the game development workforce that perhaps might go without saying, but I think it's important to say these things and highlight them at times as well. I just have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about some of the major figures, Latinx figures in game development and design. In the chapter version of this talk, I go into greater detail about all of these individuals. But I'll say, in addition to George Gomez, we have famous people like John Romero, who is known as co-founder of id Software and developer of classic first-person shooters Wolfenstein 3D and especially Doom. Coined the term deathmatch, established all sorts of FPS tropes, and also less known is a developer of Mexican American and indigenous heritage of Yaqui and Aztec ascendants, and he says that his Native American and Mexican heritage have informed every game that he's ever made. And he's become a big spokesperson for diversity in the game industry, highlighting how important it is that people be able to see themselves represented in games and that people definitely look up to other people that they identify with. And he talks about, meeting fans who are Mexican who didn't realize he was Mexican American and what a difference it makes to realize that there are these role models in the industry for people in that position. Here we have the photo that I've been using throughout this. Mortal Kombat co-creators John Tobias and Ed Boon with Raiden, who is played by the Filipino actor Carlos Pesina around 1993. So Ed Boon is also a Dominican American developer who's worked not only on many Mortal Kombat games, but also a number of pinball titles and other games. And he highlights the fact that his co-creator of Mortal Kombat was also
30 years
Latino.
ago,
And I just have like a couple seconds to play here, and I'll wrap up.
I guess I can't specifically say what we're doing. It's just because we want to, we do have something planned. It's going to be fun.
Oh, sorry.
I'm
sorry, it's the wrong part, but I want to say that the gist of this is that he says it's important. Some people don't realize John Tobias is also Latino, and the two of us are really great creative partners in it. And the fact that Mortal Kombat was created by two Latinos isn't something that's really talked about much, but I think it should be. It's something we're very proud of, and it's been great to carry the torch for these 30 years, just representing in a sense, right? So this has evolved with the development of indie games by companies like that game company co-founded by Kelly Santiago, Venezuelan American game developer. We could also talk about industry leaders, including Reggie Fils-Aimé of Haitian American descent, former chair of Nintendo of America, or Cristina Amaya, who is one of the co-founders of Latinx in Games, as well as major streamers, esports athletes, journalists, etc. So all of this is really still just kind of scratching the surface. My hope is that this talk and the chapter version of it and the anthology that it's a part of will be a part of moving forward discussions about diversity and Latinx presence, and also telling these kind of untold stories of how video games have always been Latinx, even when we haven't been able to see them that way or haven't understood them in that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil, for that presentation and for helping us understand also in a much more richer way how games are made and the influence of underrepresented minorities and peoples, and not minority at this point, in regions like in the US. Thank you for that. Alenda, can you turn on your video if you're there? Awesome. Thank you. So now I have the incredible challenge of trying to wrap up all of these like awesome presentations. As you know, I'm pretty familiar to your work. It's been inspiring for me, and I mentioned that I am the co-founder of Rio Junto and Ludocrítica, who are organizing this event, but I also need to mention that my other important hat is that I'm co-founder at Niebla Games. Niebla Games is an indie studio based in Valparaíso, Chile. We make video games, we've launched board games, and all your work has been inspiring for me, and on not only on my own like research on doing my dissertation about game design and production in Latin America, with focus on not only on indigenous representation but also the participation of indigenous communities on the game making in the region. But now I want just to mention some things and why this conversation is so important, and all the links that I've been noticing, and this is kind of a dream having you like all these works talking together and sharing with those friendly faces and with so many lovely people joining us here today. So on one hand, Brendan, for me, like it's curious because before the book, like that made this huge hole on the not only in academia but also beyond, there it's important for me to mention that I encountered one of your articles having like a Bourdieusian approach to analyze the Australian ludic field, and when I was trying to create a dialogue on an approach on the ludic field in Latin America, on board games and video games, and how I've been thinking about Pierre Bourdieu's approach as a like a ludic correspondence theoretical approach to understand also the game board. So this has been something great, and once then I encounter like this book that like takes that approach also and goes beyond, has been great, because now, as Alenda said and comment, it's kind of hard to say game industry without like feeling something itching somewhere, right? Alenda also, her bright work on playing nature, and has been like super impactful for me, because I got into academia uh, like trying to no, don't worry, Brenda, thank you for that. But I came back to academia with an interest on doing like on having a sustainability and an environmental approach, and your work has been deeply inspiring, not only on my academic, it has been, but also like in a personal. I told you, and Pablo Cuarta is here from the cooperative Matajuegos, that Pablo's work with yours created a dialogue that turned into the game Wildfire Chile 24, that was a game action made to support the victims of the huge wildfire that we suffered in Chile this year, and help us to raise funds to help the victims. And also the question about the impact and the production, turning back to who then are creating the games and who are representing which life forms, which ecosystems, which relations that happens in those spaces, we can see in that game. and also like feel that it's the person that after Gonzalo Frasca, who is one of the early game studies people from the contemporary game studies, Phill has been the person who whose work was the kicker to consolidate the Latin American academic field for many of us. For me, it's like, okay, you need to to show like your stance and your arguments to about like why this is important. Okay, I have Phil's work here. Now, can I go beyond? Because many of us that are doing Latin American game studies, we have many things that are already told, but sometimes we need to break some barriers because of the power dynamics that academia has. So Phil's work has been not only super useful for like in academic way, but also to open and to attack those barriers that we sometimes need to face. I have so many things that I would love to share, but instead of saying all of that, I'm going to share my screen a little bit just to show a little bit of what we do. So and why this makes sense to have like this conversation. So this is some of the games that we've done with Niebla, and some of the ones that I wanted to mention are like Hogan Puma and Wildfire. Wildfire is this one that I just mentioned, so you can go and check it. It's a small game made with Bitsy. And this is Hogan Puma, that it's a game based on the indigenous chronicler of the Andes, Felipe Guamán Puma de Ayala. This is a game made having all this conversation in myself, in my mind, in my research, and how to think and do some action with the work that we do. And this is a minimal game made with Bitsy about this indigenous chronicler who made an impressive titanic work in the 1600s, like a book, but it's a letter addressed to the King Philip III denouncing the abuses to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This is a small game. I'm not going to talk too much because I want to prioritize our conversation. But this game has been recognized and critically acclaimed, having nominations for the Amaze Berlin Festival, for big, and now Gamescom Latam. We can even talk about that, like Gamescom Latam buying big festival and so many things. But here I'm applying the Latin American approaches to game making, the questions about sustainability on environment, but also like cultural sustainability, and also like the game making. It's an ecosystem complex. It's a field where we need to recognize not only the industry approach, that it's something that coming from Chile, it's pretty interesting, and I don't want to overexpand, but analyzing and studying the Latin American game production scene has been really insightful on getting on how these different narratives have had impact in different regions. Like in Argentina, for example, we have cases like Matajuegos, a cooperative, one of the most important cooperatives, game cooperatives in Latin America. We have Cuatro Assets. We have Chiri Games and awesome projects that have done incredible things from the region, and resisting of this idea of the industry that in Chile, that the ecosystem more developed in the early 2000s. We started from an industry conception, and that narrative impacted our first few years. And then we started to having like other questions and conversations and knowing about those other cases. And it's interesting to know like how these are developing in different and so much complex ways. So just to mention like this project that some of you know, kickstarted a further project having all these things in mind, that is Andean Futures. So based on a collaboration that started with Hogan Puma, with Kenya, with Cesar and Jessica from the communities on Pisac of the Ñaupañan community, we started a collaboration with the Kusikausai Andean Association for a project called Andean Futures, where the pilot is going to be made in Pisac in Cusco, Peru, where we are going to conduct ludic workshops with youth so they can create their own games, represent their own spaces, and to think about the future for people that has been historically excluded from the making, from the imagining of the futures and the world, and to think about themselves as artists, creators, researchers, So this is a community-based research project with ludic approach using open source tools and minimal tools, considering also the impact that trying to state that there are there are only some standards that we should use to create games of quality. It's a narrative that we need to attack, that we need to resist, and that we need to propose and create new ways. So this is just a super quick wrap up of this experience and how all of your work has been impacting my own, and I hope also the work of others through this short space. So with that said, thank you again for your work, for your presentation. And now I'm going to open first a conversation for you. Like, do any of you have a question to each other, or I can do it. I have like so many notes.
Thank you, Nico. That was a wonderful response, and I wanted to thank Phill and Brendan because they got a lot out of your presentations, and I think it's just great. I think we've said it a bunch of times already, but it's wonderful that you got all of us together and that you all are here, and hopefully we'll have a really great conversation about this. I did promise earlier that I was going to ask Brendan about Annapurna. And maybe we could talk about, I don't know if people know that the entire games division of Annapurna all quit because of failed contract negotiation, or they wanted to basically start their own studio. But I don't know if it gives us an occasion to think about the relationship between the game industry and Hollywood, which has its own problems. I don't know. We could think about this.
Yeah, great. And just echoing Alenda, yeah, thanks again, Nico, for the response and for organizing all this, and Dylan, Alenda, for your great presentations. Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to say about Annapurna, but it is a super interesting, what do you call it? A case study, I guess, example of just for broader chaos going on and just for weird things finance capital is doing. Annapurna is an interesting one. Fallon Parker has a really interesting book chapter in Paolo Ruffino's edited collection on independent video games about Annapurna and boutique indie developed publishers more broadly. That one you can also get a PDF of, but maybe not legally. But okay, it's academic publishing, do it. Anyway, what was I actually saying? Yeah, I got distracted by academic publishers instead of game publishers. Yeah, Annapurna is really interesting because even if the film version is just a billionaire's rich daughter, like vanity project, right? Like, and just she has all this money, so she get
Larry Ellison of Oracle. I mean,
yeah.
It's just like so ridiculous. The industries all incestuously.
Totally. Yeah, I see. I do actually interesting things I have to say on it. So I'm not super well versed in the specific one. It's really interesting in terms of like workers just organizing like that. It's just cool to see like stuff is we're all just going to walk out. But I've seen some critiques of, well, maybe they should like, instead of leave, just not work and strike rather than go to the immediate scorched earth and try to demand better conditions. But I think it's cool seeing them all organized regardless. But it also just highlights there's a real gap still in game production research. One that many people are starting to realize of just kind of not just looking at labor and looking at developers themselves, but developing, I guess, kind of finance literacy to actually trace finance capital and money. And there is some starting, like David Nieborg does some good stuff, and Daniel Joseph. And there's a book that just came out last year, I think, on Steam. I'll look it up and put it in chat once I stop talking. We're starting to see this kind of political economic, where's the money going, who's kind of pulling the chains kind of research. And it's something game production studies hasn't done historically. We've primarily focused on the ethnographic, going and talking to developers, which has been hugely important. But I think the next step is going beyond the developers and being like, doing some maths and spreadsheets and figuring out what are the actual trajectories of flows of capital and exploitation, which in indie publishers like Annapurna kind of really beg the question to figure out where is this money coming from, essentially, and where is it going?
Thank you. Now, before we go with Phill, I'm going to invite everyone to turn on your cameras if you want. Remember that we're going to be publishing this conversation afterwards. So I saw that Cami, Ilya, you were with your camera on before. So Adolfo, if you want, that would be awesome. And it's so great to have all of you here. So now, Phill, please.
Yes, I want to try not to take too much time with my question. I hope we'll have time for questions from the group. But when Alenda, when you were speaking about thinking about sustainability not just in aesthetic terms, but in practice and in resource conservation, it got me to thinking about kind of practices of recycling and reuse through out of necessity, like piracy and bootlegging and adaptation of technologies in the global south, and kind of where that fits into the concept of sustainability in game development. And this also related very much in a way to some of the thoughts I was having about your talk, Brendan, thinking about work outside the industry, or the weird indie stuff, as I think you rightly called it at one point. So I think that maybe there's kind of two levels, like a hobbyist level and necessity level. Like, and it also, I think about the people studying this, and there's kind of that divide as well. So some of the authors you put up, Swalwell, Nooney, Kirkpatrick, maybe are more like the hobbyist homebrew, culture model versus certainly Benjamin Nickel is working on piracy and, these sort of adaptations that don't serve the purposes of creativity or hobbyist, curiosity, but rather fulfill an economic need or desire. So I just wondered, and Svelch kind of somewhere in between those, it's like hobbyists who are also responding to their socioeconomic circumstances. So I just wonder for either of you how that role of piracy and of kind of peripheral production, but that's not homebrew, because of the love of it kind of production, how that fits into both of your discussions.
Oh gosh, it's a good question. I actually, now you're making me think of my like VCD collection from living in Taiwan for a year. Had a lot. No, I mean, I guess I am interested in, in a separate sort of hat, I do a lot of editorial work in eco-media studies, and I'm a big supporter of open access publishing and trying to get that to be more common in the humanities, and in the United States where it's not super well supported. And I think I kind of welcome that kind of creative reuse and also openness and sharing of resources. And then that kind of gives me an opening to just mention that some of my work more recently has been about modeling, and especially asset libraries. Like I'm going into these libraries that we all use to get, 2D or 3D models. And I know, Brendan and Ben Nickel have written about this in terms of Unity and the sort of, the snooty feeling that people have about asset flipping, like taking pre-bought assets, but that's misplaced, right? It's from a sustainability angle there, that actually is, actually better. And, so I think that some of the work that will be coming out that I'm doing is really combining aspects of your talks, because I'm thinking about the sustainability of the labor, but also thinking about cultural specificity alongside ecological specificity. Like Phill, your Wired article about, I think I actually cited the article you wrote about Far Cry 6 and how everything it gets wrong about Cuba. Like all the cliches are there.
Glad you like that. That's good.
Yeah, I loved it. But I was also like, why does it take a AAA studio to get like, specific flora and fauna for a fictional Cuba, right? Like, why is it that I can't go to SpeedTree, which was recently acquired by Unity, and it's one of my case studies? And why the hell is there no mulberry tree in the SpeedTree catalog, but there are like 80,000 apple trees? When mulberries are so important to like Middle Eastern cultures and even some American cultures, it's just really funny to me. And so anyway, this is what it makes me think of.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I segue on that, which hopefully will actually connect to the answer I was going to give. Is interviewed a developer in the Philippines who was an indie developer that had previously worked at Ubisoft Manila. I think it's just out of Manila, um, and which does a lot of outsourcing. Because of course, a lot of AAA outsourcing ends up in Southeast Asia, and they did a lot of outsourcing work on Far Cry 6. And he kind of reflected on when they were working on Far Cry 6. It gave him a drive to want to to quit and go indie, not because of the work conditions or anything, but because making this like Cuban environments kind of felt like making like Filipino environments. I think they're, I don't know, similar distance from the equator or something. And he was like, why am I like making this environment on the other side of the world when I could be making games about my own culture and place and whatnot? So he quit and went indie. That was a really interesting story. But I guess that the real answer I wanted to give, sorry, was more just about, to me, I think it mostly comes down to just how we think about and I guess discursively construct I guess like legitimate and illegitimate game making. Like so in like to not get too deep in like the Bordosian theory that I've already blocked out of my head after publishing a book, is like all position taking in a cultural field is about kind of claiming legitimacy to the position you're taking, and like by doing that, kind of making every other position relatively um, less legitimate than your position you've taken. There's a real kind of political to where you stand. So when you go like, you know, when a cliche example is when an indie developer's like, you know, screw AAA, I'm going to go make this experimental, actually creative thing, or, you know, a punk musician not selling out or whatever. Like that is position taking. But in games, like historically, like the industry has had such tight control over the discourses and cultures of game making, where we've thought of the industry as the entire game making field. All game making beyond the industry has been kind of perceived as illegitimate, I suppose, whether that's piracy or homebrew or modding. I think game studies historically has spoken about modding, not as a thing developers do, but I think players do, which to me is always quite striking. Like it's a developer activity once Counter-Strike starts making money. Before that, it's a player activity. And it's not that it's one or the other, it's just how it's kind of positioned. It's not development. And so I think things like how to kind of tie this all together. So I think historically, all these kind of forms, like whether you're a hobbyist, whether you're part-time, whether you're pirating and asset flipping and just cloning, like all of these are seen as illegitimate compared to the legitimate way of making games, which is working as a business to make money. And so I think part of what I want to achieve with the book and think more broadly is like, how can we scrutinize what is currently kind of considered legitimate and illegitimate game making? Not that all illegitimate game making should be legitimate or vice versa, but that we currently have a very narrow industry defined idea of legitimacy, which kind of stuffs up students who then want to maybe like, you know, after they graduate, maybe shouldn't quit their job at a supermarket when they start making games, just like a musician wouldn't. But like, or the indie development team doesn't have to scale up to AAA. You know, there's other ways to be legitimate making games. And also just like, it means like, sorry, I'll wrap this up in a second, but like we see with like, you know, like Nintendo, you know, acting kind of a lot like Disney in the game space, really, in terms of like just IP hoarding. Like anytime anyone does something with Nintendo IP that they don't like, you know, they crack down on them, like Power World or whatever. But also the amount that the commercial or the legitimate relies on the illegitimate. So the amount Nintendo relies on the free labor of ROM hackers and modders and software developers to make emulators work, and then they just take those emulators and put them in their SNES Mini, while then like suing the ROM creators out of existence at the same time. So the legitimate and illegitimate have very complex interrelations. So in terms of where value is made, piracy is so important for huge parts of the world to even access any game, and then you know that creates markets for the sequel that then gets a legitimate release where like people are pirating the previous game. Um, Ramon Lobato and Julian Thomas's work on the informal media economy I find really valuable as well. Just I don't know, it's all complex. Who gets to decide what's legitimate and illegitimate game making and game consumption? I think it's just always worth asking. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that was great. And yeah, 100% with you both on those answers. Ramon Lobato's Shadow Economies of the Cinema has been really influential in the way I think about that with games as well. But thank you both. Thanks.
Thank you. So now we're going to open space for questions with the audience. We have a question for Cami. Cami's here, there.
Thank you. Let me lower my hand. There we go. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. So I have a question for all of you that presented, included Nico, and it's a bit self-serving because tomorrow I have this talk that I need to give at the recruitment fair in my institution, right? And on the one hand, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself. I am the wife of someone who works in the creative industry. So my husband has worked in video game studios and he's done graphic design and illustration for video games. And so I see very closely just how unstable and precarious the industry is, right? And how not industry it is. So Brendan, when I saw your book, I was like, yes, okay, great. Someone's saying it. And on the other hand, about a year and a half, I got hired in this institution, right, to be the video games professor in this audiovisual design program, right? So the kids, not the kids, these young adults are coming to me asking for how do you enter the industry? How do we get there? How do we become the game designers that we want to be? And it's really heartbreaking on one side because they are highly motivated, right? But they're also typically from lower income families, right? Like in the United States, you would associate this with like the Latinx type of family, middle class, right? First generation. Similarly here, my students are Chilean, so they're also kind of like middle class, first generation, going to college and asking me like to make the promise that they will have a job in the industry when they graduate. So my take on this has been, I'm sorry, this is a really long question. My take on this has been to say, well, if you study video games, you can study them as culture, right? You can study them as art, as communication, as persuasion, and all of these things that like as media. But there's this insistence of we have to develop programs for this. We have to develop courses for these kinds of kids. So I'm wondering what kind of answers you have for your students. How would you talk to a student who is trying to go to college so that eventually they can join this industry that is actually very precarious? Like, what do you say from an educational standpoint when confronted with this question? Because right, like here in the Zoom, we can all say, yeah, like it's all smoke. But the reality is that there are professionals in formation trying to join this work culture, this work space, right? So yeah, to them, all of you.
Yeah, I have opinions, but I'll let the others go first because my last answer was so long. So Phill or Alenda.
Phill, you started an entire major. Maybe you should talk.
Yeah, this is my day-to-day kind of bread and butter at the University of Delaware is talking to students about, their potential careers in game development. And I myself am from cultural studies and, analyzing games as culture. But I quickly came to realize there is a very, very small percentage of my students who are really interested in that specifically, like in being a game studies professor or writing books and publishing them like the panelists here, and myself included. That's a special breed. Most of them just want to make games in some way or the other. So they're artsy folks who want to like animate, or they're programmers or they're musicians or whatever. I'm the eternal optimist, I have to say, and I fully agree with the thesis that the industry does not exist. I also fully agree that, it's in a state of collapse and it's more precarious than ever, but it's an extremely, powerful industry as well as greater field beyond the industry. And I think it is important to think of that I'm encouraging students to think about how to use these skills in education, in science labs and cognitive science, and all these other things that they can do with related technologies beyond the game industry. But that said, I think there is going to be a place for them to work. Um, the world is precarious and employment in all fields is precarious, and the game industry is growing, not shrinking overall. I guess I'm the eternal optimist. That's what I would say. It's like it's not going to go anywhere. It collapsed several times already, right? I mean, it's going to keep going. So there's jobs, and there's jobs for people who, can do all sorts of different things. And you might be working in marketing or advertising or law, but there are different ways to work and to kind of shape your life around video games. I think we should think more than just, a lot of people think working in the video game industry is coding in the coding room, doing code, right? And so I think we have to break that paradigm and say, yeah, that's like one thing that people do, but even that, they want you to know a little more than just this one, thing going on in this one room. That's what I'll say.
Brendan?
Yeah, sure, I'll go. Yeah, it's a really important question. And it's one of the questions I wrote down for the other two, actually. So, and that I didn't ask, so I'm glad you asked it. Thank you. It's something I think about a lot and thought about. It's kind of where the fact my whole project started. The way I got the funding for it was really this like scaremongering stat that I could use for the government, which was like Australia graduates. I think it was like 10,000 game development graduates every year, and the industry has 2,000 people working in it. Where are they going? Where's the like the real creative industries embedded creative transferable skills kind of argument? Which I don't know, I'm not so happy with now, but it got me the money to do the project. But yeah, like, so when I used to, I think like this whole like game production is cultural production means when I speak to students or speak about games education, it's like, we don't stop teaching music production just because there's not enough paid jobs for musicians. We don't stop teaching creative writing or poetry because there isn't enough paid poetry jobs. We don't stop teaching, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. But the difference is like, even if you go into like a poetry degree, optimistically 19 years old, I'm totally going to be a famous poet. Like in part of your head, you know how like unrealistic that is, even if you're going in with all the ambition to make that happen. A lot of game dev students don't go into a game dev degree at 18 or 19 knowing that's the reality of game development, because they're not thinking of game development as precarious cultural production. They're thinking of it as Ubisoft, EA, the headlines in their local paper about the indie kid who made $1 billion, not the other 1 billion who made $1. So like, I think it's really, really important for educators to, regardless of the marketing of your institution, to like from day one, make sure the students know what they're actually getting into. Of like, and I used to say to my students, you've signed up for a poetry degree. Like, that's cool. Like, it's very important that some people study poetry, but you've got 3 weeks before the university takes your money out of your account. This is at a private place. So like, you have 3 weeks to decide if that's actually what you want to do. Like, yes, you can get jobs out of it. Yes, you can build a career out of these skills, but that career pathway isn't linear. It's going to rely on a lot of like hustling and personal networks and unpaid work, like, and just like trying to become a musician. But if you can like get that, I guess, like make sure they know what they're getting into, I guess is kind of the best you can do. But also the way you do that as well is like, you don't just get the skills and then make a video game for your CV later. You just like a music, like you don't finish a music degree, then start making songs. You're making songs, so you go and start a music degree. And so I think it's all about that mindset shift, but none of that solves the structural issues of having to be entrepreneurial and having to do the hustle and all of that. That's kind of beyond the scope of that. But also Alison Harvey has a bunch of great critical research on game dev education. And she makes the important point that there's also the trick of like not instilling what she calls this like masculine bravado of like, it's so hard to work in the games industry that then the students just end up doubling down to the, well, I have to be the tough one who survives. I have to be the one who does for 100-hour weeks, whatever. So how you get that kind of sense of solidarity, sense of like knowing their worth and not being overly exploited, but also knowing realities of creative labor. Like, it's a really complex thing to balance all that. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to making them understand it's cultural production, not just getting a job at a software company, because that's not how it works. Even in North America, unless you live in one of a few specific cities or have the ability to move to those cities. But yeah. Cool. Alenda, did you have anything?
I would just add, I used to have a game designer with around 20 years experience that come talk to a student organization that was aspiring animators and designers, game designers. And he kind of was really helpful in laying out how it used to be that you could get an internship at a company, and that was how you kind of got in. And then it kind of became about academic programs where if you went through certain degrees, you would have an in to the industry. And then he said the kind of contemporary climate is really none of that guarantees you a position, but that you get stuck in a sort of chicken and egg thing of you need to create a successful game to be noticed, to be asked, but you also need to become part of a company to be able to make a game or something like that. So I mean, I think we could kind of find fault with some of that, but I thought that was helpful. But I like Brendan's discussion of how it's, seeing games as cultural production. I've seen this because I came to games, the academic study of games, through first the academic study of literature, and then film, and then games. I used to be really into Shakespeare and documentary and other stuff. So I do think people, I mean, students who want to make successful cultural production in general need to be interested in other things. Right? Like my freshman year screenwriting professor was like, you all are going to write crap until you're 30. Like you just need to get out there and like become interesting humans. So just like resign yourself to that. So not the best like speech, but thinking more broadly about how do I develop myself, and how does that differentiate me? Like, and games is just one thing, one way of expressing that.
Yeah, and I would add, yeah, that becoming that of becoming interesting humans, it's huge, and I wouldn't say that they don't have anything interesting, but but I would invite them to explore like those interesting things that they have done or their backgrounds or what they want to explore. So there's like a huge like blank page that they can fill with so many things, and I love the ludic metaphors to work on that because for me it has been super useful when I thought about my own journey as a character cheat of an RPG. Or okay, what classes do I want to develop? Like which adventures would I like to share with other people and that makes sense on my own path? And also when I started teaching in game development programs back in 2017, and I see a couple of former students here that they can confirm. My first class, especially for the first year, it's always like changing their expectations. So all of you want to create the next MMORPG. That was like the trend at that time, and it was like demystifying what we do, demystifying also those expectations that the industry have created that are like so toxic toxic for like the creative endeavors that games may have, and and sharing from my own experience at that time. Now we have like more programs, we have also like so many interesting examples that may be done, like games as art, games as passion, so many communities. I wanted to mention like arts games in Barcelona that curiously they just started like a reading circle on Brendan's book recently, and they make like awesome cultural events. So if we're passionate about games, that's something that we need to connect with early on, while also trying to resist to the narrative of the big AAA industry, so they can like explore. It's not that they need to have the answer. And in Chile in particular, because I was working in universities where many students were recipients from government grants to study, and usually those grants are like just for one program. And if you study like more than one semester, you can't use it for another career. So that's why I felt the political and ethical responsibility on taking from the first year and telling them, if you think that you're going to work on this kind of games, it's possible, but that's not the reality. And thinking about game production and sharing my own like successes and failures, we need to understand that also we are in institutions that they want you here until you lose your grant, so they can receive all that money. And this is something that you need to know from the day one. And everything that I'll be sharing here, it's an invitation for you to decide this semester if you feel the passion on like passion about on games, and that you can explore it from small indie experiments on taking the works from other people and sharing it with others, and or to take it to education or even like marketing or other like commercial endeavors. Like it doesn't matter, like look for your passion early on, but decide, because this and many institutions are trying to take all your money and the opportunities that your family had been working all these years. So let's use this moment to explore, to experiment, but that it's the fail faster, but also fail cheaper as soon as possible, with creativity and encouraging them to be like yeah, curious also about that. We have a question of Janine. I've got a question for Brendan. So Janine, do you want to write it or do you want to turn on your mic? Yeah, thank you.
Bear with me 1 second. I'm trying to get my camera up.
Mm-hmm.
It might not be working. Bear with me 1 second.
Don't worry.
It's because I joined from the browser and it's just being finicky.
Don't worry. I can read some of the comments.
We can hear you at least, so if you don't want to blur off your camera.
That's fine. So I just, first of all, thank you, all of you, for chatting. I was really intrigued by the conversation from you, Brendan, about social capital, like Purdue level social capital. I think is very applicable with questions of sustainability from Alenda about the cultural capital that comes with saying we have sustainable game dev processes, or the cultural capital that comes from representation for Latinx developers, as you said, Phill. My interest, this is mostly a comment, my interest is in voice acting in games and the kind of social capital that can be imbued in trying to couple the game industry with the movie industry, and how deeply the assumption is that we've arrived because now games actually are as important as movies in that aspect. Just mostly that's comment, but I'm also seeing that coupling happen with a variety of system-based things that have typically been almost PC only. So my question for you, Brendan, it seems very kind of sad for the industry to start to fail in a lot of the ways that it's trying to regroup and switch directions. One of the directions I'm seeing, I don't know what your thoughts are, is bringing in modding communities. So I recently saw with Baldur's Gate 3, they just opened up this big console-based modding capability that's also open to PC players. I've seen CD Projekt Red open RedKit for PC players. It does seem like there's potentially a potential room to talk about social capital in new avenues that are being applied to things that were typically kind of that renegade PC player. I wonder what that means for what the freedom of that process would turn into if corporations began to see that as a new avenue to reroute the game industry towards.
Yeah, cheers. It's a really interesting reflection and observation. I'm not super familiar with very specific versions of mods being available on consoles. I know I believe Bethesda's done something similar recently with their Doom re-release, where you got to log into Bethesda's online portal to play a 1993 game, but then you can access mods on your Xbox and stuff, which is kind of interesting. I guess more broadly, this might not be a direct answer, sorry, but I guess broadly it's just interesting, and modding is really interesting for this, and user-generated content. It's just for broader way the industry, I'm doing it as well, sorry, of it tries to does or doesn't capture or get value out of the informal creative labor of players and other makers, whether that's through Roblox exploiting child game developers to make their content and experiences, or whether that's Valve making Half-Life moddable and not coming to sue you until it's really successful, and then be like, hey, we'll buy Counter-Strike off you, and now Counter-Strike's a Valve game. Or just games like Dota and that just come out of modding in such interesting ways. But I guess what I feel like we're seeing now most of all is just as it gets harder and harder to make money in games, companies just trying to figure out different ways to kind of, I guess, enclose that digital commons where they can kind of claim ownership or use their own IP ownership, intellectual property ownership, to maybe figure out how to squeeze economic value out of all these different types of production, whether it's modding or just your platform users on Roblox or whatever it is. And God, I had a really smart point, I swear. What was the point there? I think something I tried to get at towards the end of the book, and I think it's more of a brain fart than a good theory, but hopefully somebody does something with it, is what's interesting today with game development, I think, is more indie developers, modders have really great access to the means of production, but not ownership over the means of production. So if you make a mod for a CD Projekt game, summary of the terms of services you've agreed to, CD Projekt probably owns that if they decide they want to own that. Or like any game made in Unity, Unity can go, that was made in Unity, we made that. Or like, get the 10% of profit on top or whatever. So there's just something really interesting there about like more people than ever before have access to making stuff and expressing themselves and sharing that with other people, through platforms and platformized tools, but also like the ability of like large tech companies and game development companies as well to like capture that creative informal activity for value generation is bigger than ever before. So I think there's something really interesting there just in terms of just how cultural capital of a creator, or whether you're a modder or whatever, is now seemingly, I think, more easily transferable into economic capital, but not for the holder of that cultural capital, for somebody else. For like Unity, you can put up a made in Unity billboard, all these cool indie games. And even if they don't own those indie games, they get to like siphon off some of that cultural capital because of all the terms and services everyone agreed to when they downloaded Unity. So I think there's something really just interesting there in relation to who generates the cultural capital and who gets to exploit it for economic gain. But I don't have a super coherent theory of that. I just think there's something really interesting going on there. But I'll leave that answer there. I don't know if the others had anything they wanted to
Thank you.
add to it.
Okay, so it was 2 hours of conversation. I would love to keep talking. I'm just going to leave some space in case that you would like to wrap up, to say something just as a closure. Alenda or Phill?
Just wanted to say thanks again, and thanks so much for everybody who attended.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same. Thank you.
Sorry.
It was wonderful.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Alenda. Thank you, Phill. And thank you, everyone here, for joining us. Thank you for the people that it's watching this now in the future present. And it was great. So please, let's stay in touch. If you want to see the recording or if you want to share this video with more people, you can find it in the networks of Ludocrítica and Rio Junto. So see you on the next one. Bye. Bye, everyone.